Natasha Sharma is a therapist, award-winning entrepreneur, and the author of the Kindness Journal.
Her TED Talk on emotional fitness has inspired over 300,000 people. She's delivered keynotes and workshops for global brands like L'Oreal, Emirates, Desjardins, and AOL.
And if you've ever watched Hoarders on A&E, you may have seen her in action.
But beyond the accolades and media appearances, Natasha is someone who really understands people. In this episode, we dive into her personal journey, from launching a business to becoming a therapist and educator, and what it taught her about fulfillment, fear, and growth.
Get ready for a deep and inspiring conversation with Natasha Sharma.
Welcome to the Enriched Mindset Podcast.
My name is Nikta, and I'm a third-year psychology student at the University of Toronto, and I'm here with...
Rain. I am also a third-year psychology student at the University of Toronto.
We're here with Natasha Sharma. Welcome.
Thank you.
Let's get into the questions. So, we're curious to know what career you started in and what initially drew you into that field.
I actually didn't have a clear idea of what I wanted to do, which is very common.
Yes.
And there's quite a bit of pressure on people in high school and in undergraduate years to know exactly what you want to do. I did a business degree and I worked at several large companies, Canadian companies, for a few years, mostly in marketing and supply chain management. I learned quite a bit about how organizations work and how mostly I learned much more about how people work and how, or maybe rather how they don't always work together. And I think that kind of helped lead me to where I am a little bit more today.
Did anything initially draw you to business?
Truthfully, it's interesting that you ask, because I think if I could go back, I would do things differently.
Right.
But I had originally applied for sciences, and I remember going home. I was walking to the mailbox. Back then we mailed in applications too. And I remember going to the mailbox and I was about to drop the applications in, and I actually had a change of heart, and I changed the program that I was applying to business. Really, there wasn't as much thought put into, if I'm being perfectly honest. I knew that I didn't want to do science, but I didn't know what I wanted to do. And I thought that doing an undergraduate degree in business could give me some options to open up at the end of it. So
For sure. I really resonate with that. I always tell people I think it's absolutely crazy that you have to pick at 17 years old what you're going to do with the rest of your life.
it never pans, well, it rarely pans out that way nowadays. I think there was a time and place where people were more fixed in their working lives, but now I don't even think that's possible anymore, with a very few exceptions.
For sure.
What were some of the companies you worked with earlier on?
I worked with some pretty big Canadian companies. The Bay was actually one of them.
Oh, I worked at the Bay.
In their corporate office, and you know, we know what's going on there with
Oh,
the
no.
Bay.
I know, it's sad.
Well, Sun Life, that was actually a wonderful experience. Mm-hmm. I actually that was probably my most enjoyable experience. And in terms of working for a large organization. And where else? Oh, and Estee Lauder.
Oh, yes.
Estee Lauder as well.
Did you get free skincare?
I did.
Oh,
I did, among other things.
What was that experience like for you working with these big organizations?
So I think that was a very different time and place. We were talking before social media existed at all. And we were just sitting on the cusp of the information age at that time. So it really was different for me, because these organizations were very large too. I think it would have been a different experience had I worked with a smaller startup or very small boutique type of company. It was difficult to feel like your work was meaningful. That's not to say that corporate work isn't meaningful. I think it can be, and I've since revised a lot of my thoughts on that as well, particularly as the way we see it today. And I don't think it was the corporate environment necessarily that was a poor fit. It was what I was doing. You know, I was working in marketing and coordination type roles. I don't think it was using, I think, some of the skills and interests that I had. I did have, the role that I had at Sun Life was very interesting, I will say. I worked in contract negotiations, and I really enjoyed that because it involved working with people and coming to conversations around difficult subjects and coming to consensus and agreement on points of difference. And I thought that that was very challenging, like intellectually. So I really enjoyed that.
So it's the connections that stood out to you.
The ability to form meaningful connections with people in the workplace is one thing, but also being able to use my mind in a way that felt like I was using the skills that I had. I really enjoy analyzing and problem solving. I didn't get a lot of that in my early years. It was a lot of execution. I wasn't involved in a lot of the creative process or a lot of the problem solving. I think that was not that exciting for me.
So what particularly made you switch to psychology? Was there a specific moment where you realized corporate life just wasn't for you and you were more passionate in this field?
It took me about a year, for all intents and purposes, really not doing much of anything. And I understand that's a privilege to do that, but I moved back home with my parents. I was still fairly young at the time, and it just afforded me an opportunity to look at what was an option for me. And doing a master's in clinical counseling, and then later a doctorate in clinical psychology. I think doing a lot of research and being realistic with myself, understanding the limitations that I had, was very important in that process, but also believing in myself. It sounds corny, but it's true, and just going for it. I think we, as young people, we need to have more conversations with older people.
Yes.
Because they will be the first to tell you that, what's the expression? The days are long, but the years are short. But that's actually in reverse of what I'm trying to say. The timeline is actually quite long. And when we're young, we're in such a rush to hit these milestones by certain years. And as you move along and you get older in life, you actually realize the timeline is larger than you think it is. So.
Right. Everyone's on their own timeline.
Yeah. And I think we tend to be in a rush when we're young. I do think that that's part of the culture that we live in here. Yes. I don't necessarily see that I've lived in I would say in some ways the U.S., I lived in the U.S., maybe is even worse. But when I lived in England, I think that timeline was a little slower. So speaking to people in different parts of the world don't necessarily subscribe to the same kind of timelines. I do think that that's a cultural thing.
Yeah, for sure.
So we have students on the Enriched Mindset podcast, and we're looking for advice. So here we have Rebecca.
Hi, Natasha. I'm Rebecca, and I'm a third-year psychology student at McMaster University. Many students feel pressure to choose a major at 18, often before they've fully explored their strengths and their interests. Reflecting on your own experience switching from business to psychology, what advice do you have for someone who's unsure if they're on the right path?
What a great question, Rebecca. I think just being aware of the fact that it is a lot of pressure. I didn't even have that awareness. I don't think it's anything. We didn't talk about that kind of thing when I was applying back then. And I think if you can become very cognizant of the fact that in today's world, and I think this is just my opinion, where we are headed, that it's going to be more important to be flexible and adaptive and be able to change more than ever. I think there will be some fields and careers that will stay relatively steady. My brother's a dentist, for example. I can't see that shifting radically, if you're going to become a dentist or a physician or even certain things like mechanics. I'm just thinking of positions that use our hands as the main tools. I think will stay relatively steady. But I think for most fields where we think and work with our minds, these things are rapidly changing. And so when you're choosing what to study, perhaps keeping that in mind, what problems are you looking to solve? What are the problems that the world has? How can you utilize your education to help you learn to adapt and be more flexible? I think that would be the focus. And don't worry so much about the major or like what it is that you're, unless you want to become one of these professions. Because if you want to do something like dentistry, then you're going to have to select a certain educational path and you're going to have to commit to it. There are people who change careers even in that field. I don't think it's common, but there are individuals who will even practice dentistry, let's say for 15, 20 years and then say, well, I don't want to do that anymore. I'm going to, I don't know, like start a business or I'm going to write books or so. Just be flexible with yourself.
Open-minded.
Yes.
I think that's a lot of things that young people struggle with, is being open-minded.
Yes, I think just having the knowledge that things are likely to change, like careers are likely to be fluid and shift for the most part going forward.
Well, we're curious to know what made you decide to start your own practice instead of working in an established clinic.
So I did work in a clinic for 3 years. I worked with them for quite some time, and that was great. Going into private practice was always part of a plan I had in mind, just because I wanted the flexibility, I wanted the freedom of being able to choose my own hours and set my own schedule, but I also wanted to build something. I wanted to create something. And I wanted to be challenged by that, and I wanted to implement things in my own practice or drive certain changes to how we deliver psychotherapy and therapy services through that. And honestly, like I said, a personal decision to have that flexibility. You know, it's starting a family around that time, and it provided a lot of ability for me to create my own schedule, and I think that was helpful.
So what do you think's been the key to success for NKS therapy?
100%, I would say the first thing would be the quality of the team, like the therapists. I've tended to create a team or be very selective in the kind of people that I bring on. And they really are the heart and soul of a practice. So I would say, give a lot of credit to the team that I work with and how dedicated they are and how they align with my philosophy for the most part on how to provide these services.
Yeah, what qualities do you look for
In a therapist?
in a therapist? Yeah.
So typically someone who is able to understand the nuances of clinical work. And when we're young and starting out, we subscribe almost by the book to how to deliver this type of treatment, how to work with clients. And as you get into it, as you begin to grow in the field, you realize that it is not black and white. It's far from it. And so the kind of things that I look for in therapists are people who can grow in the field, people who are actively willing to grow, not just because they have to for professional education requirements, but because they really want to learn about themselves and that are really good at working independently and working with a team.
So you're a therapist and you're an entrepreneur. Does that come with any challenges?
Definitely, I think being able to switch hats. Being a therapist requires a certain set of skills, and you're looking at things through a certain lens of compassion and empathy and guidance. But then when you switch hats and you are working on the business side or operations side, you certainly still want to maintain that collaborative nature, but you're looking in the best interests for the business as well. At the end of the day, you want your business to run, you want it to be profitable, you want it to be lean, you want it to have good relationships. So I think switching hats is sometimes can be challenging.
Okay. Is there any advice that you would give students who want to become a psychotherapist and eventually start their own clinic?
Yeah, I think it was really valuable to get the experience working with another practice. There's so much to understand from a practice management, from a regulatory standpoint, from a clinical standpoint, from those more experienced. So definitely work with some kind of an established practice or clinical organization first would be my advice. The second thing would be to be prepared for an environment that is really changing. I mean, we have the integration of, for the first time in a real way, technology into therapy and how therapy is being provided. And I think being really informed about that and having a good understanding of how that's being integrated. Right. And then maybe lastly, just understanding the landscape of how the competitive landscape, but also the regulatory landscape is really important for private practice. That could be a whole other podcast. So
Right. So on the Enriched Mindset podcast, some of us want to be psychotherapists. Just out of curiosity, how much can we expect to make when we just start?
So depends, right? So if you work as a psychotherapist with a larger community organization, it's tough to say. You could work with a hospital, you could work with school boards, you could work with a private clinic. And I think the range is quite wide. It could be, if you're a salaried employee, you could start anywhere from 50 to 60,000, but up to maybe 80 to 90 in the school boards, depending on what you're doing. Working in someone's practice is usually a percentage of the billing, typically. That's how I do it in my practice. Therapists make a percentage of what the billing is, and it's typically anywhere from 50 to 70% of the billing. So it can be good. It depends on what that rate is, and there are guidelines established. So most clinics will stay within the confines of what the associations recommend that you charge per treatment. Many things come into play also, how experienced the therapist is, the number of years of practice they have, but anywhere from, I'd say, starting at around 120 per 1 hour session for an individual therapy session, up to maybe as high as 250 to 300. Or of course, if you are in private practice for yourself, then you would make the full amount minus all of the expenses. That becomes a business conversation as well. There's expenses, right? You have your hourly rate, but then your take home is much different than that. It's not that number.
And what do you think are some of the most common misconceptions about mental health?
Common misconceptions about mental health, I think I have to say that has been really starting to become more prevalent in the conversation today. And that is this myth that therapists and psychologists and people in mental health must have their lives together, living these magical unicorn lives where they can deal with it. Not true, not true at all. And I think in particular, therapist burnout and some of the impacts of the profession are now being spoken about more than ever. That's something that I think that I would have liked to receive a little bit more understanding of in my education, is just how heavy the work can be and how important self-care is, how important boundaries are for therapists, how important understanding who they are and what they bring of their own, because nobody comes into this world without baggage. And so I think one of the biggest misconceptions is that therapists themselves have it all together, and that's not true. That's not true. They're just as human. That's like saying dentists never lose teeth or get cavities, or physicians are immune to cancer, and it's not true at all.
For sure.
Yeah.
So how do you help clients understand the importance of addressing the root of mental health struggles rather than just the symptoms?
So there's a few ways. That can be a long process. I think the traditional approach was what we call psychodynamic therapy, but my focus has tended to be on the current environment and current lifestyle. So root cause being twofold. One, what your immediate environment is like, what stressors are in the environment, what is potentially not working in the environment in terms of work, in terms of relationships, in terms of stability. And 2, your lifestyle. So are you eating? What are you eating? Are you sleeping? How are you sleeping? Are you exercising? What are you doing? Is it enough? The quality of relationships and your interactions with the basic tenets of how we take care of ourselves is what I tend to see as largely a lot of root cause for some of the things that we all deal with.
Right. And I know we mentioned previously the show Shrinking.
Oh,
so
yeah.
I watched a few episodes and it was really interesting, honestly. And Jason Segel, the actor from the show, shared how therapy can sometimes turn into just talking about problems without making real progress. Do you think that's a risk in therapy? And how do you make sure your clients move towards actual change rather than just rehashing the same issues week after week?
That's a great question. I've been in that situation where it has come to that. My approach has always been to be very authentic about it, like what is happening right now, and to actually give that feedback. One of the ways to avoid that is to have very clear objectives, very clear goals that a person is working towards in therapy, and trying to have some way of measuring the results as you go along. And even just being in the space of someone, there are individuals who may not have anyone around them who validates them at all. So even just an hour sitting with someone who can provide that is not invaluable, even if it doesn't have a clear takeaway. So I think I need to make that point as well.
And so his character also is known for sharing blunt truths with his clients. Like, I remember the first episode that I watched, he told his client, your husband is emotionally abusive, just leave him. As a therapist, where do you think the line is when it comes to being direct and honest?
The line in that sentence is just leave him. The line occurs in the what was said before that.
Yeah.
So what was it? Your husband is emotionally abusive.
Yes.
I would say that's fairly above the line in my view. But he crossed the line when he said you should just leave him. That's a really good. It's a good show. Really good show. And I certainly was trained this way, where you don't disclose any kind of personal details. You don't disclose personal opinions. You're like but how is that human? And I didn't understand that until I began practice. The other thing that was strange about that is that even as we were being trained that way, we had a lot of education around Yalom, very famous therapist who was in favor of self-disclosure. I think that it can be valuable when a therapist discloses in a session with a client, provided it is moving that client forward, provided it has context to help the client and not the therapist. So if it's there to form a connection point, because, as I think Brene Brown is the one who said this, but we all know that 2 of the most powerful words for connection are me too, right?
Right.
Me too forms an immediate connection between 2 people who share a vulnerability or who share a pain point. So I think when there is potentially a place for that in the therapy session, but it has to be the right time, the right place, and the right motivation. And giving direct advice, I think, is a very tricky line.
Right.
However, providing your opinion on something after a reasonable amount of time where you have explored something with a client, I don't think is unreasonable.
Right. Okay. Yeah. That makes sense.
With your therapy style, do you practice self-disclosure with your clients?
Rarely. So on occasion, yes, sharing in a pain point or a struggle with respect to raising kids, which is relatively benign, or it might be stress around work. I have heard of therapists that will do that. There have been moments in time where it felt right to say something that helped move the connection forward and help move the client forward.
Right. And I like how you mentioned that all therapists at the end of the day are human, and like we all go through our own stuff. They're not perfect people. They go through their own issues. What is your take on a therapist maybe crying during a session and showing a lot of empathy in that way?
Generally, I would avoid that. However, if a client is sharing something, we're therapists, right? We're talking about being in a room with people who are sharing their most difficult moments with us. It would be impossible to not be touched by some of these moments. So ideally, you have built up a skill set where we can hold space for these without emotionally reacting in the moment.
Right. And, you know, AI has been a really hot topic lately. I don't know if you've read. Dr. Lee also had a blog published about the future of AI in a therapy setting. And so I'm wondering what your opinion is on that. Do you see AI as potentially helping the mental health field, worsening it? I know they can't provide the emotional connection that humans need, but I'm just wondering if you think that it's going to be helpful.
I think it already is.
Yeah?
Yeah, I'm going to read that blog. I'm really interested to see his take on it too. I think it already is. I don't think, certainly at this point in time, it's not replacing the human contact of a therapist, the humanity of sitting with another person and actually making that connection. But I've sat with ChatGPT.
Yes.
Really?
Yeah.
Me too. I can't lie.
Yeah, I have. I mean, and not just like craft me an email that makes me come up with a therapist to, no. I think that there's a lot of value to it. I think that it's getting better. I've noticed it every month that I use, it gets better, even just comparing it to using it last year versus this year. I think using that in the absence of having nobody or nothing, especially when therapy it can be very costly, presents a real opportunity and a real advantage for people who can sit with a program or a chat bot or OpenAI and actually have a conversation in a way about what it is that they're going through, and receive quite a bit of information and tips and even a plan, even a strategy, even a direction to move in to help themselves.
Right. That's a great perspective.
So as a student, I do use AI. Sometimes it's a very helpful resource, but do you think AI is affecting students' ability to manage stress?
I think every student should have access to a therapist. I think every human should have access to a therapist. I don't necessarily think AI is making it more stressful. I think it's the opposite. If anything, it's providing them an opportunity to, in the absence of having access to a therapist, it's something that they can use. As it gets input, it gets slicker and slicker, right? So I think being able to trust being a key component of a therapeutic relationship. I'm fairly trustworthy of it so far. It has holes, like I don't take it completely at face value, but I find it pretty rich. I've had people tell me that 2, 3 in the morning they'll go on to ChatGPT and start asking questions as if they were speaking to a therapist, and or if they just need a connection, they speak to someone, and it's helpful. Yeah, it's really helpful. Right. I've never heard a person say that it's not helpful.
I know, it's definitely helped me in my darkest times when I haven't had a therapist.
Right.
So, yeah, just moving on here, I was curious about your TED Talk on emotional fitness. It seemed to resonate with a lot of people. Can you break down emotional fitness to our audience?
I think emotional fitness is being able to, in a nutshell, just understand what we feel. And that's not an easy thing to do. Just being able to identify and understand our own emotions is a really difficult thing. We are not taught that, generally speaking, or we have not been taught that. And not only to understand what we feel, how we feel it, when we feel it, using the language, like we haven't had the language to articulate feeling. And when I think Brené Brown came out with the book, really, really important thing to have is the language to be able to express what we're feeling. And I think that is how I would define emotional fitness today, and being able to, of course, be in control of that and be able to manage our emotions as best we can.
Right. So on the line of emotional fitness, we have another student seeking advice about emotional fitness. This is Liv. Time.
Hi, my name is Olivia, and I'm a second-year psychology student at McMaster University. I'm a very emotional person, and often my decisions are based off of my emotions. Physical fitness is pretty straightforward. You go to the gym, you eat healthier, but how can I start practicing emotional fitness? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good question. Our emotions really will rule the roost. We like to think of ourselves as cognitive beings. We're not. We're emotional beings. And if we are in a heightened emotional state, that emotional state will be in the driver's seat, like it's driving the boat. Never a good thing. No good decision was ever made when we were in a heightened emotional state, either positive or negative. And I think where we really need to practice to answer that question, what we really want to strive to, is a little less of that and to be more level. That comes through mindfulness, meditation, meditative practice, really understanding how to feel calm in our reactions to things. Not an easy thing to do. But yeah.
So as a parent, how do you even teach your kids about emotional fitness?
How old are your kids?
9 and 12.
9 and 12.
They'll be 9
Okay.
and 12. You have to model it, and you can't be perfect. They have to be able to see you. I do things with my kids that my parents never did with me, which is to tell them, like, well, I apologize. I've apologized to them for things. Recognizing mistakes, admitting mistakes. They know that we don't think that we're perfect. And I think that that's a starting point. I think a lot of emotional volatility stems from rigidity or rigidness in self, like perfectionistic tendencies. So helping them be self-accepting. I mean, I have boys, so they don't always necessarily want to. I don't think any kid really wants to talk about it. Boys definitely don't want to talk about it. But we try. So I think when they give the window to try and help them identify what they're feeling and giving them a language. I go back to the language, giving them the language to use, to describe, to talk about what it is that they're going through, to talk about what it is that they're feeling. I think that's important as well.
So something that we learned about you as well is, correct me if I pronounce this wrong, but you're a black belt in Goju Ryu.
Oh.
We did some deep digging for that.
Yeah.
Goju-Ryu? Goju-Ryu?
Goju
okay.
Ryu. Thank you. So do you think martial arts shaped how you see life, how you approach situations?
I haven't done martial arts in a long time, and it is something that I really enjoyed. I actually enjoyed being in an environment where I had to defer and listen and respect. And I think that's actually really, really important for young people, but older people as well. Like just to be in an environment where you learn that kind of discipline and just being able to respect the process and your peers. It was a huge element. So yeah, I think it was great.
Here at Enriched Mindset, we're really curious to know what your opinion is on the connection between money and happiness.
I think there's a connection. It's interesting. I've seen newer research coming out which suggests the opposite, I think, of what I've always understood, which is that it can certainly contribute to happiness up to a certain point. Maybe happiness isn't the right word, but stability. I think stability is a huge part of well-being, and money and stability certainly are quite related. So I still believe that up to a point, money offers that kind of stability or the options or the freedom, the resource, right? If you look at Maslow's hierarchy, we need the basics of life. We need to eat, we need shelter, we need warmth, we need clothing. I think certainly going beyond those to have options to enjoy life, I think it increases the enjoyment and satisfaction of life. I don't know if it increases well-being. In fact, I still stick to my thought that it does not correlate strongly with personal well-being. As you see, people who are wealthy, people who have quite a bit of money who still struggle.
Right.
So clearly.
Yeah. So just to end off our podcast here, can you let our audience know where they can find you, if you have any exciting projects coming up? You
can find me on the web at nksTherapy.com. I intermittently use social media, not as much, but I'm on LinkedIn, and that's where you can find me.
Perfect. Thank you so much for joining us on the Enriched Mindset podcast. Thank you to our listeners.
Thank you so much, Natasha. It was such a helpful conversation.
Thank you for having me.